Dear students, in 486 BC, a competition began at the Dionysia among strictly comic playwrights as opposed to the tragedians who appended satyr plays onto tragic trilogies. This date is suggested by the victory lists, which give the names of the playwrights and even some titles of early comedies. The reason for such an innovation at this particular time is fathomable. In general periods of tension, like the years encompassing the Persian Wars in classical Greece, or more recently, World War II, have led to innovations in artistic, political, and religious customs on the reasoning that new and better things suit times of high social stress and rapid cultural change. It is no surprise then that a new form of drama was imported into the Dionysia in the 5th century. The victory of the Athenians at Marathon during the First Persian War in 490 BC went a long way towards confirming to them the validity of their experiments with life, liberty, and the God's will. Moreover, tragedy already well underway was there to serve as guide to the new genre of comedy, like an old sister telling a younger one what school will be like. A general scheme was also suggested by tragedy, on which comic drama could be formulated. Indeed, early Greek comedy seems to have borrowed many features wholesale from it. For example, the opening monologue, the paradox, the alternating rhythm of episode and chorus, and the egg gown. Through perverse borrowing, comedy also inverted features common in tragedy. For example, noble characters were made base, sacred odes became bawdy ballads, and solemn dances turned into lascivious stripteases like the infamous Codex dance mentioned by Aristophanes in the Clouds. Primarily, comic plots were considerably looser than those of tragedy. Scenes did not necessarily follow each other logically, showing that it was more important for early comic playwrights to be funny than tell a coherent story. Even Aristophanes, who worked towards the end of the 5th century, constructed plots which are not always well integrated. They often take unexpected and inexplicable turns in the story. Wherever and however humor is best served. Humanities, the earliest Athenian comic poet known today, is little more than a name attached to a few titles like Beggars, Heroes, and Persians. Magnes won at least 11 times at the Dionysia and exerted a more lasting influence on comedy. Cratinus competed against Aristophanes probably more than once. He had 6 victories at the Dionysia and 3 at the Lemnia. From his surviving quotes, it is clear that his plays were awash in the bitter criticism of contemporary politicians and public figures. Another older contemporary of Aristophanes was Philocrates, who was ingenious in story construction. Sadly, nothing remains of his plays. The greatest contemporary and foremost rival of Aristophanes was Eupolis. No complete play of his survives. He had 3 victories at the Lenaea and 1 at the Dionysia. Unfortunately, it is hard to gauge an old comedy in pieces, since scenes do not necessarily cohere logically or follow a predictable scheme. Comedy was, no doubt, produced at the city Dionysia, but it was more at home at the less formal Lenaea. 3 comic poets, each with a single play, competed, and their comedies seem to have come in the afternoon after a series of 3 tragedies and a satyr play. Old comedy of the 5th century was very different from the type which later developed. It had run a long course before Aristophanes produced his first play in 427 BC. But the only extant examples of old comedy are the first 9 of his 11 extant plays. Friends, old comedy is one of the sports of literature. There are at least 2 reasons for this. First, the art of comic drama was still in its infancy, and playwrights had not as yet developed ways of integrating comedy and complex plot construction. Second, because of its nature, audience and critics did not take the art of writing dramatic comedy as seriously as tragic playwriting. The Archon provided a chorus to comic playwrights only at a later date. The choristers were volunteers. When the comedy acquired some features, the names of its poets were noted in the historical records extant in Aristotle's day. Who introduced masks or prologues or a multitude of actors and such like things is not known. Comedy was fantastic from the very beginning, and it deliberately cultivated its perversity. Full of outlandish characters, costumes and settings, it is at heart an exuberant and joyous celebration of the human condition in all its excesses. Comedy seems to have originated from simple amusements of the Greek rustics. The situation can be imagined. In summer, vintage is good, grapes have been gathered, and it is time to sing and drink. In this festive spirit, normal codes of restraint and good behavior are relaxed. People poke fun at the authorities, the village elders, the warriors, and even the gods. The native Greek genius for dramatic expression finds a vent in topical songs, stump speeches, and farcical arguments. They entertain each other with comic antics, horseplay, and buffoonery, much of which moderns would find grossly obscene. But for the simple villagers, it was natural and harmless, springing from the circumstances in which they lived. Fertility, birth, and regeneration were part of their lives and as legitimate for humor as anything else. The humor of the Greeks was the spontaneous self-expression of a fun-loving people. Aristotle says that comedy originated in the improvisations of the leaders of the phallic rites. An example of these ceremonies designed to assure the fertility of field, herd and human being is found in the Acharnians, where Dicaeopolis marshals his family to celebrate the rural Dionysia. Aristotle confessed that comparatively little was known about the early history of comedy even in his own day. When comedy acquired literary form, it kept many of the elements of these rustic celebrations. As in tragedy, 3 actors were generally used, with a chorus, but the pattern of comedy was looser and more variable. Within this framework, the same forms of humor recur. The choral origins may be found in the Komos, the drunken revel, in connection with the worship of Dionysus. The actors were taken from the chorusless comedy that existed among the Doric Greeks long before Old Comedy came into being at Athens. Epicharmus, a comic poet among the Doric Greeks of Sicily in the 5th century BC, dramatized amusing situations and debates. Doric comedy also had a close and obvious connection with phallic worship, for the actors used to be costumed in a lascivious manner and wore the phallic symbol. Very similar was the costume of the actors in Attic Old Comedy, which was very different from the dignified costume of tragedy. These facts tend to substantiate the theory that the actors of Attic comedy were derived from that of earlier Doric one. The chorus of Attic comedy, however, was dressed differently because it did not wear the phallus but carried it on a pole. For example, in the Acharnians, the chorus often appeared in fantastic disguises such as those of birds, flies or horses with riders. An old Attic vase shows men riding on dolphins and ostriches accompanied by a flute player. In Birds by Aristophanes, for instance, the chorus are dressed as different birds and the action takes place in a magical never land between heaven and earth called Cloud Cuckoo Land. Masks, of course, were worn universally, and Doric masks were not very different from the masks of the actors in Old Attic comedy. Dear students, typical plot of Aristophanic comedy is constructed very differently from that of a tragedy or a later comedy. This comedy had to invent its own plot. It was usually topical, satirizing personalities and movements of the day, often referring to living people by name or thinly disguised. Comic playwrights enjoyed unlimited license. Similar attacks made from the stage today would provoke a barrage of slander actions. Sometimes they overstepped the mark and were punished. But a society as secure as the Athenian democracy at its greatest could permit much that a weaker state could not have tolerated. Even the gods were not immune. There has been no later parallel to the way in which the Greeks permitted their gods to be shamelessly mocked at on the stage. There was humor for all tastes. A favorite device was to parody the high-flown language and stage conventions of tragedy. Subtle wit was followed by slapstick, and obscenity by scintillating paradox. In contrast, the choral lyrics were often of real beauty and rank among the most delightful of poetry. It began by making the leading character conceive a happy idea, ridiculous in its very extravagance and impracticality. For example, Dicaeopolis in the Acharnians conceives the idea of making private peace with the Spartans. This idea normally meets with a violent opposition. In the Acharnians, it comes from the old charcoal burners. This opposition is overcome in a farcical debate or egg gown. The idea is now ready for the test of actual practice. But at this point, the actors retire and the chorus comes forward to address the audience in the parabasis. After this purely choral section is completed, the actors return to the scene. The happy idea is now in practice, and the results are dramatized in a series of scenes between the main character and various typical figures which have been affected. These scenes have little or no connection with each other, and there is no dramatic development, but emotionally they tend to rise to a climax. The structure of old comedy is ideally suited to polemics. The first half of the play is devoted to statement and debate of the question. The second half to demonstration. The plot of the comedy is an idea which is set forth partially by the dramatic action and partially by direct verbal appeal. Failure of the critic to realize this leads to endless confusion. Certainly, the different constructions of the two parts of comedy can be adequately explained by functional considerations. In regard to subject matter, the first half is closely knit and events follow in the relationship of cause and consequence. The section between the entrance of the chorus and the parabasis is normally taken up with the debates. The chorus is intimately concerned with the action, more intimately than is normal in tragedy. Interlarded lyrics, therefore, are eminently suited to this section of the play, for they naturally lend themselves to continuity, to balanced speeches, and to binding the chorus more closely with the actors. The second half of the comedy is normally quite different in subject matter. A series of independent scenes illustrate the happy idea in practice. These scenes very naturally become independent episodes. The individuality and the importance of the chorus fade away very markedly because their function as antagonists has been fulfilled. In short, the structure of old comedy, though strange at first glance, can be explained in terms of the material and the effects to be achieved. The comedies invariably open with a scene in simple iambic meter. In Aristophanes, these scenes are usually very striking ones. For example, old Dicaeopolis sitting alone on the Nix, ruminating on the war and gazing longingly at his beloved countryside. The technique of giving the exposition shows an interesting development. A monologue suffices in the Acharnians, and this monologue is followed by a series of scenes which in general dramatize the situation already described. Essentially, the same technique is used in the clouds. The Nights, however, opens with a dialogue, but instead of bringing out all the exposition in this most natural fashion, the author merely whets the interest of the audience, and then one of the speakers steps forward and gives the exposition in a frankly informatory address to the audience. This technique is repeated in the wasps, the peas, and the birds. Real dramatic exposition has been achieved in the Lysistrata, the Thesmophoria Susi, and the frogs. The final two plays, the Ecclesia-Zusi and the Plutus, tend to give up the ground one and revert to a monologue, prologue of the Euripidean type, which became the rule in later comedy. The happy idea is normally revealed and the action proper begun in this opening iambic section of the play or prologos. This section closes with the entrance of the chorus or parados. But the action here is usually rapid and continuous. The parados, in turn, normally leads up to the egg gown, which has a very elaborate and carefully balanced form with interlarded lyrics, that is, epirhythmic construction. It begins with a lyric sung by one half chorus, that is, strophe. The Corypheus or leader then encourages the first speaker in 2 lines of spirited recitative, that is, katakalliosmos. The antagonist, who is sure to be the loser, then presents his case. A monotonously long harangue is avoided by having his opponent frequently interrupt with questions or amusing comments, that is, epirhythma. The first speaker ends his case with a more rapid final appeal, spoken perhaps in one long breath, that is, choker or naigos, which has an amusing effect. Then the process begins anew. The second half chorus sing a precisely corresponding lyric, that is, antistrophe, and their leader encourages the second speaker, that is, anti-katakalliosmos. He presents his successful case. The speech is again interrupted by the remarks of his opponent, that is, antiperima, and is again concluded with a final rapid appeal, that is, anti-naigos. The chorus now give their decision in favor of the second speaker, that is, seal or sphragis. Normally, the adversary also accepts the happy idea, and it is ready to be put into practice. Such is the perfect form of the egg gown. This occurs in the wasps and elsewhere, but more perfectly in the Acharnians. Thus, the typical ending of an old comedy is the revel rout or komos, wherein nothing serious could be tolerated. The parabasis is a telling feature of old comedy, which is even more formulaic than the egg gown. It is a step aside, choralode, addressed directly to the audience and voiced through the author and not the characters as such. That is, in the parabasis, the playwright takes the opportunity at a break in the stage action to discourse at liberty on whatever subject he wishes, not necessarily related with the play as such. It could be on the condition of the city at that moment, why he and not the other competitors should win the first prize, or anything else the author felt the need to say. The obvious meta-theatrical nature of the parabasis, as it constitutes a clear disruption in the dramatic illusion, is not out of line with old comedy. Characters of Aristophanes more than once allude to, if not point at and ridicule directly, individuals sitting in the audience. Thus, in old comedy, the playwright is focused primarily on winning laughs and a first place award, and only secondarily on matters like plot construction. The resulting construction becomes episodic, affording frequent changes of location, because the drama must follow the path of humorous delight before everything else. In the dramas of Aristophanes, amidst the riotous revelry of denouement, even the central purpose of the main characters can be lost. In sum, it is difficult to categorize a typical old comedy, especially when only the plays of Aristophanes are extant. But unlike goat song, party song is not a bad place to begin. Thank you.